Well, hello, friends. It is so lovely and beautiful to have a chance to see your beautiful faces again. Thank you so much for taking time for us to be together again. You, as our friends say, you sanctify this place by your presence. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. It's always so exciting to think about all the friends from the many different parts of the world who make the intention of being together. And it's tempting for me to also scroll through these screens and look at your faces and to cast a smile upon you and to receive the goodness that you bring with you. So thank you. Thank you for that. We are in this month, in the holy and blessed month of Ramadan, or as people in the East might call it, Ramazan. And some of us might be observing the fast. So while this is a virtual chai together, for some of us, the cup that brings us might be distinctly symbolic. And that's all right. And if you have some chai or coffee or drink, that's also lovely. The reminder that the cup sometimes has to be made empty so that we can clean it. Sometimes the most useful part of the cup is the part that's not there. It's actually the emptiness in the cup that serves the purpose of welcoming the chai and the coffee. And we ourselves are no different. Sometimes there's the need for us to pause just long enough to empty ourselves of some of the accretions that we have accumulated. At one level, it can be about the body, and traditions of fasting are certainly very beloved and honored in different traditions. And if you happen to be one of the friends who is able to fast in a bodily form, well, then I hope and pray that your fast is accepted, that it is pleasing, that it draws you near and near to God. And if you're one of those friends, and I am among them, who for some reason is unable to fast, I myself am diabetic. And so fasting would probably be a rather unwise thing for someone of a delicate blood sugar level like me. So then there's other kinds of fast that one can engage in. You think about the fasting of the heart. What would it be like for us to pay close attention to our heart, observing, in the case of a bodily fast, we usually think about what it is that we abstain from having it enter our body. Well, what kind of emotions, what kind of thoughts, what kind of impressions are entering our heart? And just as importantly, what kind of emotions are coming out of our heart? What would it be like to live in that state of awareness of our hearts? The same thing with the eyes. When you read the writings of so many of our friends from the Sufi tradition, they talk about this purification as being both what we take in and what comes out of us. It's easy enough to think about with the fasting of the eyes. maybe some kind of material that we would not wish to look upon. Perhaps there is material of a less than edifying nature that out of habit we have grown accustomed to seeing. But that's akin to eating food. There's also the glance that comes out of you. What would it be like to take 30 days and be mindful of the way that we look upon one another? Would this be a glance of compassion? Would this be a glance of kindness? Would this be to look at one another, with one another, through one another, the way that the divine beloved would have us gaze upon one another? The fast of the ear, what it is that we take in, and maybe these days, one of the most tempting ones, especially when so much of our interactions are online with people, the fast of the tongue. By extension, not just words that we would speak, but maybe a little message that we post on a social media to demonstrate our quick wit, our sharp intellect. Well, is this something that is edifying? As the old saying says, have we allowed that caravan to pass through 3 gates? Is it necessary? Is it true? Is it kind? Every question, every inquiry, every statement, we pause long enough to ask that question. Is this statement necessary? Does it need to be said? Am I perhaps the person who needs to say this statement? Or is someone among us who has better life experiences to say it? Is it true? There's so much of what we say because maybe we heard it from somewhere and they heard it from somewhere. Have we examined it? Is it something that emanates from the source of all truth, which is to say, God? And is it kind? And if so, then that statement is a statement of the fast of the tongue, and so on. So if you're joining us, I pray that whether the fasting of Ramadan is one that you're participating or not, that all of us can join in this journey of monitoring and observing what comes into us and what emerges out of us. So I had made a suggestion that in these monthly gatherings that we have, that we pick some of the lessons from the heart of the Quran for us to focus on in order to have a greater sense of depth. So I'm just going to ask a question just so I know maybe something about what to assume. How many of you, how many of us have had a chance already to get to lessons 5 and 6, the ones on the mysteries of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Alhamdulillah? And there's no judgment. This is simply trying to figure out how to make best usage. You can either put up your hand physically or, yeah. All right, that gives me a little bit of a sense, maybe about a third or so of our friends. All right, so what I may do is I'll make some comments and we'll go over a few of these teachings, and I'll try to make sure that if you've already listened to the lessons, then there's some new material, hopefully, that will be worthy of your time. So in order for us to get settled in, let's take about 1 minute and we will listen to a short little recitation. Let's see. Is the sound coming through, or is it very faint? It is.
Beni benden sorma, ben de derinden. Beni benden sorma, ben de derinden. Bir ben var.
You can feel free to put your virtual hands down if you want. This is, one of my very favorite CDs of devotional music and zikrs in Islam by the Turkish friend Uruç Güvenç. And he begins, as to so many of the Sufi gatherings, with a chanting of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And so for today, we are going to focus a little bit on this particular conversation. If you listen to the lesson, you came across a story of one of the great friends of God, the saintly beings, named Beshr, Beshr Hafi, Beshr the barefoot, as he is usually remembered. Him being barefoot is evocative to a certain extent. If you remember, it's a sign of his modesty, it's a sign of his poverty to a certain extent, but also remember that these are all symbolic stories. These are sacred stories that operate at the heart level. And why would he be barefoot? Well, in the Quran, when Moses comes to the presence of God, he is told to kick off his sandals, to remove his sandals because he's standing on holy ground, right? That's one of the deeper meanings of why in many Eastern homes, as you enter a house, you take off your shoes and you park it by the door. The fact that Beshr has been identified as the barefoot is an indication that everywhere that he goes, he's removed the sandals of his ego. You don't want to be dragging your ego into interactions with people. But when we meet Beshr in the beginning of that story, he's a drunkard. He is not yet this illuminated sage that the tradition remembers him. He is someone who perhaps has forgotten his own light. And indeed, so many of the sages that we come across, they are identified as initially having been drunkards, having been consumed by worldly matters, but it's never too late. And it's not too late for us either. There's always the time to return. And that word of tawbah, which sometimes gets translated as repentance, simply means to return, to reorient yourself towards God. And in the Quran, we are able to return because God has already turned towards us. In the story of Adam and Eve, God repents. God performs the tawbah. God returns to humanity. So it's that resuming of that relationship. And we're told that Beshr was this drunkard soul who's wandering through the desert, and he comes across a little scrap of paper on which was written the name of God. And though he's a drunkard, though he has forgotten so much, he picks it up, kisses it, perfumes that piece of paper, and puts it in a special corner of the house. And that night he has a dream of the divine in which God reveals to him, you have honored me, you have honored my name, and I will honor you. This very simple task of a piece of paper upon which the name of God has been written, we don't want to casually throw it on the ground, right? We want to honor it, uplift it, perhaps put it up on a shelf, or keep your especially material that has a sacred nature, a poetic nature, keep it somewhere special. Now, we can read these kinds of stories at a literal level, and indeed, it's a beautiful practice when you've got a book that has the name of God written in it. You want to pick it up, kiss it, touch it to your eyes, hold it up on a shelf somewhere. But then you also want to ask that question of what is the inner meaning of these kinds of stories? What would it mean to pick up something that has the name of God written in it? Well, we all have the name of Allah written on our hearts. At a more inward level, the example of Bishr Hafi, Bishr the barefoot, is also that example that when you're walking on your path in life, whenever you come across a person who has fallen down, recognize that the name of God is also written on their heart and pick them up, perfume them, honor them, cherish them, help them get back up on their feet. If this is the honor that we show a piece of paper that has the name of Allah written on it, how much more nobility and dignity for a human being that has the name of Allah written in our hearts. So there's a way in which this uplifting of one another becomes an important teaching of these friends. When you go on a little bit, you come across one of the first teachings that we encountered. And I'll show you here an example. Share the screen. You all can see the image at this point? Yeah. So this is a Maghribi, a Moroccan calligraphy, dates from the 19th century, of a stylized writing of the name of Allah. Allah. Some of you who have graced us by accompanying us on the programs that we undertake to Morocco, we've sat in shrines together under large calligraphic descriptions of this name. And as you can imagine, there are so many interpretations that are given to this notion of the inner meaning of the name of Allah. Some people take it quite literally. They emphasize that it's just the word for the one God. And it's the same word that Arab-speaking Christians, Arabic-speaking Muslims, Arabic-speaking Jews, and others have used. We know that the languages that Jesus spoke, Aramaic and Syriac, the word for God sounded a lot like Allah. There is a particular Sufi named Qurtubi. Qurtubi means someone who's from Cordoba. And he spent the early part of his life in Andalusia, in Cordoba, the second half of his life in Egypt. And in the Quran commentary of Qurtubi, he comes up with a rather novel interpretation of this term, Allah. I'm not interested in us proving definitively that this is and that is not the right definition. We want to receive these teachings from every direction, right? There's such a blessing in each one of these insights. And Qurtubi says that the word Allah is related to the word walah, which means bewilderment. In other words, his idea is that the intellect becomes bewildered, astonished, to use the phrase of Rabbi Heschel, radically amazed when we come to encounter God. And it's useful to think about a genuine spiritual tradition as being one that's like a bird with two wings. There's the wing of your intellectual life, and there's the wing of your devotional and spiritual life. And just as for a bird to soar, these two wings have to become balanced with one another. In our own life, we need to come up with a balance of the spiritual and the intellectual. Sometimes, especially in a modern context, we can err a little bit too much by only wanting to come to God through the intellectual, through the rational. Well, the intellect has its place, but so does that realm of bewilderment. If you look at some of these beautiful calligraphies that you see in Islamic art, you see that they start out by writing that pronoun hu or huwa, which in the context of the Quran is used to introduce the names of God. Huwa Allah, al-Rahman, al-Rahim. And in the lesson, you might have come across that one of the great commentaries that we have on the names of Allah, written by the great sage Sam'ani, he says, every one of the divine names, al-Rahman, al-Rahim, al-Malik, al-Quddus, you've got to move your mouth and move your tongue and maybe move your teeth to make that sound. So just pay attention to your mouth. Ar-Rahman. Like, see what happens to your tongue and to your mouth and to your lips. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Malik. Right? Your mouth moves, your tongue moves. Maybe you have to put your tongue against your teeth to make certain sounds. He says the one that does not require any movement is that term hu. Right? That's the Persian pronunciation of huwa, the Arabic pronoun for introducing God. It says hu is simply the sound of the breath. Hu just emerges from your heart. That the beginning of the calling on God is simply the sigh and the breath that comes directly from your chest, directly from your heart. If you go to different places, you oftentimes see that that who is written in a mirrored way. So imagine a vertical line being drawn right down the middle. What is on the right mirrors what is on the left. Right? In Turkish mosques, you see this example being used quite a lot. I want you to keep that sense of mirroring in mind as we go through the mysteries of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, because we're going to encounter this again and again. The same idea shows up in Islamic architecture. When you go to the Taj Mahal, arguably among the most famous monuments in the world, it is both a great building built to love, and if you read the inscriptions all the way around it, it is an echo of paradise. Well, the Taj Mahal is reflected in the pool below, just as the Taj Mahal itself reflects the celestial paradise above. If in the previous example, there's a vertical mirror so that what is on the right reflects what is on the left, in places like Taj Mahal, what is above is reflected below. And the pool that is in front of the Taj can reflect the Taj if it is still, if it is tranquil. If, on the other hand, some mischievous kids are throwing pebbles and rocks into the Taj, well, the surface might become wavy, and that picture of the Taj is going to be broken up. You might have to give it some time, wait for it to settle down before you can see the reflection of the Taj become clear again. It is the same way with our hearts and the relationship of our hearts to these divine qualities that we're encountering in the Quran. If you look within and you say, oh, you know, I don't feel anything, I don't detect any of this celestial reflection, it's probably because our hearts are agitated. That surface of the heart has become scattered, just like a pool that the pieces of stone have been thrown into. If our hearts become so open to every impression, every thought, every emotion, that it sends us into a state of tumult, it's very difficult to see the reflection of the one in the many. It's very difficult to see not only the Taj, but the Lord of the Taj being reflected in your heart. So there's a time to have this serenity. There's a time for excitement and passion and burning and longing. And then there's a time for serenity. The natural world is our great teacher in this context. There's a time for fruits to come to fruition. There's a time for ripening. There's a time to let go of leaves. And there's a time in the winter for the life of the tree to return to the roots. So we have to learn to observe our own heart in this way. One of my favorite examples about this, the relationship between the Asma al-Husna, the beautiful names of God, and our being, is in the magnificent city of Esfahan, where my own family hails from. There's a wonderful, beautiful palace complex that is known by the name of Chehel Sutun. Chehel Sutun meaning 40 pillars. And you go there and you start counting up the pillars, and there's only 20 of them. And so people are like, why are they calling this the 40-pillar palace when I only see 20? Well, 20 are visible and 20 are in the reflection. It's when you put together the 20 pillars of the palace made out of stone and wood with the 20 that is reflected in the water that you reach that cosmic mystical number of 40. The prophet is 40 years old when he receives the revelation. Jesus is in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. The people of Israel are lost in the desert for 40 years. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights. at the time of Noah, and there's 40 columns if the surface of the pool becomes tranquil enough that the 20 above and the 20 below come together. Can we learn to mirror these divine qualities? Can we bring together the Rahman and Rahim and reflect them, shine that light in our hearts? We talked about at one point how when you read the stories of the friends, sometimes they become so absorbed, so drawn to these divine names that they lose themselves. It is, imagine a drowning in which you do not give up your life, but you become the drop that returns to the ocean. So there's that wonderful story that I had shared with you. There's a friend who's walking in the desert and someone comes to him and says, "Where are you coming from?" And he says, "Who? My God." "Okay, where are you going to?" "Who? What are you seeking? What are you searching?" "Who?" Right? Now, we usually say this. These days, so many of us are encountering experiences of the passing away of loved ones. We have seen some of the great large trees in our community pass away recently. Dr. Abdullah Ghazi, one of the pillars of the American Muslim community, just having passed away. Imam Suhaib Sultan, having just recently passed away. And so many of you, so many of us know of people whose lives has been taken, perhaps by cancer or COVID or just natural age. And when you hear of someone dying, people always say, "Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un." We come from God and we're returning to God. What if we don't just say that at a moment of death, but as a life orientation? Where do you come from? God. Where are you going to? God. What are you doing here? God. That is the mantra. And to have it come from the heart, I mentioned that in many Turkish cultures, when you see another person, you very gently touch your hand to your heart, you bow down ever so slightly. You're not bowing down to the person, but to that divine spark, that breath of God that mingles inside every person. Ooh, I see something in you of God. And our friendship is based on bringing out, and won't you please help me also remember in whose image I am made. Ooh. Last time we had a conversation about the whole mystery of the be, of Bismillah, the dot under the be, which becomes the goal of the realized human being. And this time we want to go just a little bit into the mystery of Bismillah, al-Rahman, al-Rahim. I was very touched that one of the friends on this journey had written a poem which consisted of 113 times introducing God as Al-Rahman and Al-Rahim. The Quran has 114 chapters, and 113 times we are introduced to this divine qualities of Al-Rahman and Al-Rahim. So I want to pause and move us through the two parts of this statement. Bismillah, not only in the name of God, with the name of God, through the name of God. Ibn Arabi says that the name of God is a barzakh. It is an isthmus. It is a portal between the world that we live in and the celestial realm. And the sages oftentimes say that the name of Allah is a name of majesty. It is a name of Jalal, of divine glory, that we tremble before the majesty of God at simply uttering the name of Allah. But if God was only a transcendent God, a majestic God, an awesome God, then we would be missing that element of intimacy. And so they say that we move from the Jalali quality, the majestic quality in Bismillah, to the Jamali quality, those qualities of love, beauty, mercy, intimacy, and tenderness. So these two qualities, Al-Rahman and Al-Rahim, these move us in that direction. Yes, at one level, the goal is to have a balance of majesty and tenderness for God and for those who are called to be God's mirror, God's reflection, those of us humans. But at least in this path, there's an inclination towards mercy, towards love, towards tenderness, and towards the feminine. So I shared with you in the statement from the Prophet that we hear this account in which the Prophet shares a statement. Al-Rahim shujnatun min al-Rahman. The womb is named after Al-Rahman. The womb, Rahim, is named after Al-Rahman. There are other sayings in which God even speaks in the first person. I am Allah, I am Ar-Rahman, and the womb is named after me. So this intimate connection between the creative, feminine, all-enveloping, nourishing, and sustaining quality of God, which is where Ibn Arabi comes up with the idea that it is as if, ka'anna, right? He's not speaking the language of theology, he's using that mythopoetic of the sacred. It is as if the whole universe, all the realms seen and unseen, are contained in the womb of God. It's as if God is pregnant with you. It is as if God is as dependent, independent by himself, herself, and yet we as the universe are so dependent on God as an unborn child is upon a pregnant mother. And the great poet Jami, of course, says the reason that the Blessed Prophet is called An-Nabi al-Ummi is not because he didn't know how to read and write, but it's because Ummi, he is the maternal prophet. So God has a matrix. Long before the movie Matrix, remember that the word matrix had to do with the notion of a maternal womb, that we do live in a matrix, and that matrix is the divine feminine womb of mercy, the creative force of God. And God's prophet is a maternal prophet who loves you more than your own mama and your own baba. These two names of Rahman and Rahim are differentiated from one another. Rahman is talked about as imagine yourself being on a wide open field and the rays of the sun pouring down upon you. It's that aspect of divine mercy and compassion that falls on you, on the stone, on every blade of grass, on every animal and tree, saint and sinner alike. Rahman is like that all-enveloping sunlight. Al-Rahim has a laser-like focus. It is individual, it is personal, and we're told that part of God's compassionate quality is to save 99 out of 100 parts of this creative, redemptive, merciful quality for the next world. I'm mindful sometimes in using this language of the feminine and the womb to remember that there are those of us whose relationship with the womb has been a painful one. It might be the relationship that you have with your own parents. It might be the relationship that you have with your own children. There are those who might have tried to conceive and not been able to, those who have conceived and lost children during the journey of the soul. So I think one wants to also be very careful in remembering that there's 1,000 metaphors. Hold them up to the light and to see which one your heart responds to. By the way, I would also encourage you sort of at this point, if you have specific questions about the lessons or what we have been talking about, to go ahead and put them in the chat line. I think one of the friends was saying that there's a little bit of an audio issue. Let me know if that's any better now than it was earlier. And to remember that these qualities of Rahman and Rahim are not only about God, but they're also about us as humans, just as we are intended to be the mirror, the reflection for these divine qualities. That very same statement, which is in the Hadith collection of Tirmidhi, in which God reveals that the womb is named after Rahman, Al-Rahim shujnatun min al-Rahman, has an earlier part. And I'll read that part for you in Arabic and then in English. Ar-Rahimun yarhamahumur Rahman. Right? This is the beauty of the Arabic language. The sentence has 3 words, and all 3 of them come from this root of rahma, loving mercy. Ar-Rahimun, the merciful ones, yarhamahum, will be shown mercy, are shown mercy, Ar-Rahman, by the merciful one. Ar-Rahimun yarhamahum Ar-Rahman. Arhamu man fil ard. So show mercy, envelop them in your loving, protective matrix of mercy, those who are on earth. Yarhamkum man fis sama. And therefore, those who are in heaven, God who is in heaven, will show you mercy. There is an echo, there is a reciprocity between what we do on earth and what happens to our celestial fate. I want to pause here and open it up for your questions by reminding you of two aspects that are talked about in the lesson, but it's maybe helpful to revisit them. Part of this journey that you all are going on is also a journey for me, and I have been so enjoying following along these teachings with you, learning some things that I didn't know before, going a little deeper into some parts of the Quran and some parts of the Sufi approaches to the heart of the Quran, and been thinking a lot recently about this question of the feminine. How do we have a conversation, a real conversation about the feminine in a way that does not detach the conversation about the feminine from the conversation about women? There's been a long tradition of rather patriarchal voices in Islam and in every tradition, which speaks so eloquently about the masculine and the feminine, but they don't seem to have a mumbling word to say about the actual conditions and struggles of real life women on earth. I think we all at some point recognize that the goal is to have the human take on divine qualities. We don't want to take God and have God dragged down to the human realm. We want the human being to become more godly. We don't want God to become just a man. So when you do find some of these little gems and nuggets, it's helpful to pause and to look at them. Ibn Arabi has an extraordinary line in his magnificent Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan openings, that he takes this term Rahman and Rahim, and he talks about Rahamut, a distinctly feminine adjective, and he talks about the divine Rahamutiyat, the feminine mercies of God. How lovely would it be to have Muslim thinkers, spiritual seekers of all faith backgrounds, pause and reflect on these feminine divine mercies, to look at a creative tension between our earthly language, to recognize that God transcends them all together, and yet to avoid that trap of collapsing and reducing God to an earthly notion of the masculine or an earthly notion of the feminine. I'm waiting, by the way, for you all to type in your questions, because if you don't type questions, I'm just going to keep talking until 3 o'clock and then say, have a beautiful day. In the lesson, you also saw a hadith Qudsi that comes right out also of the Christian tradition. You find analogies of this in all spiritual traditions. And it's that paradoxical kind of a language where God says, I was hungry and you didn't visit me. I was thirsty and you didn't give me water. I was sick and you did not come to visit me. And people are very perplexed and say, you know, you are the Lord of all the worlds. How could you be hungry? And God responds, did you see that one over there who was hungry? If you had visited them, you would have found me, ma'a. I would have been with them. So there is this notion of a divine withness. I am with them. I am with those who are hungry. I am with those who are thirsty. I am with those who are sick. I am with, as one of the sayings of the Prophet says, I am with those whose heart is broken. You want to know where God is? Go to the hungry, go to the poor, go to the thirsty, go to the occupied, go to the imprisoned, go to the brokenhearted, and you will find God with them. These are the kinds of qualities where Maulana Rumi at one point says, God's pure love, pure mercy is like water, and water always flows down. If you pour water on a mountaintop, the stream will flow down towards the low valley. We are also called to be like this. So the quality of Rahim and Rahman, as it becomes reflected in us, is not some holding your head up in detachment of saying, well, this too shall pass. I realize that you are suffering in that corner, but may Allah grant you sabr. No, there is, you refuse to be compassionate by proxy. You recognize that God is not in a building, but with those whose hearts are broken, with those who are thirsty and hungry. There is that immediate agency. Majida is asking a question. What about giving to the person who doesn't deserve it? Well, on one hand, for us to practice enough humility, enough modesty to say, maybe we don't always have full and complete knowledge of who is worthy and who is unworthy. But on the other hand, if somebody is sitting, let's take a hypothetical example, in Mar-a-Lago and has toilets of gold, and then on the other hand, you've got a child who is sitting in a cage. Well, maybe that child in a cage, maybe that Black mother mourning yet another child shot down by the police. Maybe those in Flint, Michigan, still not having pure water to drink. Maybe those who have been bombarded for the 20th year in a row, those are perhaps more worthy of direct compassion. Also, remember that every teaching has a complementary part. And in the shrine of Abul Hasan Kharaqani, that wonderful, extraordinary early saint, there was a statement written on the wall: whoever comes here, feed them. Don't ask them any questions about their faith. If they deserved to receive a soul, John, in God's court, surely they deserve to receive their daily bread, naan, in my house. If they deserved, if they were worthy of receiving a soul in God's court, surely they deserve to receive their daily bread in this house. So think about all of these teachings together, open them up, examine them, and see which one is helpful. Yeah, so I think people are asking about Rabia. Certainly Rukia Cornell's book. Rukia was my own Arabic teacher, and it's a brilliant and wonderful scholarly book that I recommend to people. Also taking a look would be the chapter on Rabia which is in Attar's conference of the Attar's Muslim Saints and Mystics. There's a good translation of it also in the Michael Sells book, Early Islamic Mysticism. Mays has a wonderful question about this notion of a withness and being a witness. Hang on to that question, Mays, because when we come to the primordial covenant, the Alastu Barabbikum, this is where we are asked by God to bear witness to God being our cherishing, sustaining, nourishing Lord. There's a notion of a witness that comes up there. So we're going to come back to that at that time. Let me scroll very quickly through. Some friends are asking about the sayings of the Prophet with respect to the womb. I'll be very happy to share that. It is in the lesson that lesson number 5, but I'll also put it here in the chat line. There you go. Camille Helminski, yes, of course, the wonderful book on early Sufi women. It's quite a remarkable anthology of stories. Patricia Johnson talks about, is it possible that Ibn Arabi's notion of the feminine adjective for Rahman be the missing 100th attribute? Maybe, perhaps. And let us also remember that in some ways, it's a little bit like the opening line of Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. That the grail of Jesus has to be lost so that we go seeking it. And our very seeking is itself the treasure. Because at that point, we come to realize that, as Rumi says, we've been standing knee deep in the water with lips parched and dying of thirst. But that thirst is itself what guides us to water. So I find it helpful to say that the reason that out of a measure of humility, we've been given 99 names is so that we go seeking that 100th name, that ultimate. And a dear friend, Silla, who we, I think, heard from last week, and it's lovely to see you again, my sister, talks about how to embody that infinite mercy in our finiteness. I would suggest that one group of people that we would do really well to pay close attention to are chaplains. There's a very dear friend of ours here, Sundus, who has a beautiful little book that has just been published. It is on my nightstand and one of the books I'm looking forward to getting to. On one hand, you want to always remember that we are beings made by an infinite divine. We are made in the infinite. We come from a perfect source and we are bound for a perfect goal, as Pirzia always reminds us. And at the same time, we're also, in this embodied existence, finite creatures. So to be mindful and aware of where the limits of our own ability are, particularly in an age where the society and community does seem to be coming a little bit undone at the seams, it's precisely the people who are the caretakers. They're actually the caregivers. Those are the ones that you want to look after. Who takes care of the caretakers? Who looks after the ones who are always looking after others? mindful of the time, mindful that when we say 1 hour, I really want it to be an hour. But let me leave you with one of my favorite metaphors. And for Sela and for other friends, this is one that when I noticed it, it was so touching and moving for me. May it also be touching and moving for you. Some time ago, my dear wife Karina Jan and I had gone for a pilgrimage. And that's really the only way that I know how to describe it. A pilgrimage to what is one of the holiest spots in North America for me. And it's not a church, and it's not a mosque, and it's not a temple in any conventional sense. It's Muir Woods in the Bay Area. I think if God were to make a temple, and she has, at least one of those temples would be made out of redwood trees. And what was so extraordinary about these majestic trees, think about this, some of those trees were on earth when the prophet walked on the earth. Some of those trees were surely here when Rumi and Ibn Arabi and Hazrat Anayat Khan and all these great sages were walking on earth. Some of those trees were here when Rabia was here, and some of those trees might have been here when Jesus and the Buddha and Moses were here. Some of these trees reach up in towards the heavens 100 meters. Excuse me, 300 feet. And yet, the roots, or what in the South we would call the roots of these trees only go down 6 feet, 8 feet, not even 2 meters. So they reach heavenward 300 feet, but the roots are only 6 to 8 feet. How do they last for 1,000 years? How do they last for 2,000 years? These saints, and that's what these trees are, every single one of them is a saint. They have learned the lesson that we as seekers would do so well to emulate. They've taken the roots, and their roots grab hold of each other. Their roots become entangled with one another, and the minute that one of them starts to topple over, the other ones grab its roots and they say, don't you dare fall, because we stand together. And if you fall, we all fall, but 1,000 trees will not fall. And they hold up that tree until it can get stable again, and then they thrive together. We do so much on this earth alone. We have ceremonies for birth. We have ceremonies for weddings. We even have ceremonies for funerals. But do you know what we don't have a ceremony for? Heartache, heartbreak, divorce. We celebrate our joy publicly, but ask people to bear the brunt of their grief privately in that very moment that they are most in need of having other trees grab hold of our roots. Part of my hope, my dear and beloved friends, is that yes, I want us to move through the heart of the Quran. Yes, I want us to unpack the beautiful mysteries of these verses. But I hope that inshallah, with God's grace and permission and the matrix of creative, redemptive mercy, that we can also become a community of people who grab hold of one another, who reach out to one another in moments when we're thriving and in moments where one of us might be just a little wobbly. So let's pause here. May God bless you. May God increase and amplify the light in your heart and in our hearts always, always. May you be well. May you be at peace. Feel free to keep following along in the lessons. I do try to answer the questions online as best as I can. And if there's questions that you wanted to bring up for this conversation, this is open. May it be a service and a healing and a joy for you as it is for me. So on behalf of Corina Jan and baby Aya Noor, we send you our love, we send you our prayers and best wishes, and keep us in your prayers until we meet again, friends. May you be well and bathed in light, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Khuda Hafiz.